Microsoft Flight Simulator has been out for a bit and people are putting it through its paces to discover that it's an incredible looking next-gen game. I mean, really, it's mind-bogglingly good looking from the moment you load it up, and then you kind of fall into this pit of just flying around for hours, looking at the clouds and the world below you. In the here and now, these next-generation graphics require the most powerful components available to drive them at high frame rates and high resolutions. So in today's video, I will outline the performance characteristics of this beautiful game, make a list of optimized settings to maximize quality and frame rate, and then take that knowledge to push Flight Simulator to the limit on an ultra high-end customized Origin PC. This Origin PC is essentially spec'd out with the highest end parts available at that moment, orientated all on gaming performance. So it's equipped with a water-cooled Intel Core i9-10900K, an NVIDIA RTX 2080 Ti from MSI, and enough RAM and SSD speed to show how the present best hardware out there really gives an amazing experience in this next generation game. But before we get into all that, let's talk a bit about Flight Simulator's PC punishing simulation and graphics. Now, reading comments online under our videos and elsewhere, you can see that Microsoft Flight Simulator has been compared a lot to the infamous Crysis from 2007, a game which pushed visual boundaries for its time, and as far as I can tell, the performance profile of this game actually has great similarities to Crysis. Like Crysis before it, the two highest settings presets in this game add such precision and draw distance that most PCs tremble at modern resolutions. The game being this heavy though makes quite a bit of sense if you look beyond the visuals. First of all, there is how the game scales on CPUs. To show how the game scales on the CPU, I reduced the resolution in-game to 540p, so half of 1080p. In this way, the GPU is taken out of the equation for limiting FPS, and I created an AI flight path through New York City. At higher resolutions, this area in New York City would definitely stress the GPU. But at such a low resolution, cities like this in the game, with the highest draw distance settings and tons of discrete objects, they really push the CPU quite hard. A Ryzen 3900X here in this scene on ultra settings will be around 50 FPS. And this is not even necessarily the worst view of the city, as other views and vantage points at ultra settings can push frame rates even lower. This is where there is a commonality with Crysis that is key to understanding the performance in the game here. As I have found out, Flight Simulator only uses many cores and threads up to a certain point. The game plateaus its performance at around 6 discrete cores, or around 4 cores with 8 logical threads. If you have more discrete cores and threads than this, the benefits in overall frame rate and frame time stability are extremely marginal to non-existent. If you have a PC with less than this, like one with just 4 cores, you are in for a rough time with this game. At high settings with 4 cores, Flight Simulator is saturating those cores so much that the game is actually rather stuttery. The average nominal frame rate looks okay-ish, but the frame times are full of elongated stutters. If you compare this 4-core performance to 6, 8, or 12 cores, you can see how the game has a much lower frame rate overall and extremely unstable frame times. In comparison, the difference between average frame rates or 1% frame times of 6 and 8 and 12 cores is very minimal, and all core configurations above 6 still occasionally get a greater than 50 millisecond spike in frame time no matter what, regardless of how powerful the CPU actually is. Another thing to note on my performance data here is that in Flight Simulator 2020, the frame times are bound by VSync, because Flight Simulator seems to always run with a composited, borderless full-screen presentation that does not allow you to have frame tearing, even when VSync is set to off. With VSync off, the game will internally run at higher frame rates, but will only send out those frames to you that fit within your VSync window. So if you have VSync off, your frame rate from something like Rivet Tuner Statistics Server may not actually line up perfectly with what your screen is presenting to you, and that's something to remember. But in the end here, if you have more than 4 cores, you're generally good. If you have a previous generation Core i7, say with 4 cores and 8 threads, you're going to be well off in this game, but I did notice 6 real cores actually having better frame time stability than 4 cores with 8 threads. Like here in this scene where you can see 4 cores with 8 threads showing dips that are not present on higher core or thread configurations. So like Crysis before this, the game actually scales best with single core speed and frequency if a PC already has around 6 hardware threads. As you can see here, there's nigh perfect scaling of the game's average frame rate in a CPU-bound scenario with 12 cores and 24 threads on a Ryzen 3900X. When decreasing the CPU's frequency, the game's frame rate decreases accordingly in a near linear fashion. This game is currently rendering under DX11, but will support DirectX 12 in the future should the developers release ray tracing support like they have mentioned. DirectX 12, when properly implemented, would allow this game to greatly scale past its current limitations of how many threads and cores are actually very useful. And that's why having this custom-built PC by Origin is advantageous. It's an Intel-based system, and my tests show that high-frequency Intel cores deliver higher performance in Flight Simulator, higher than my Ryzen 3900X, and certainly higher than the Core i5-8400 I use in my mainstream gaming test rig. And since the CPU is such a limiting factor here in this game, you have to be more intelligent with your settings and resolution. Look at this scene here. It is so limited on the CPU side of things that reducing resolution from 4K to 1080p does not actually improve the frame rate at all, and the averages here on the frame graph are tightly grouped together. 4K and 1080p basically run the same since the CPU is limiting performance. So reducing settings is actually the greatest way to alleviate the pressure on your CPU so your GPU can scale like you expect it to. Here, by dropping down to 540p in that same scene, you can see what I mean. Dropping from the max settings to high, medium, and then low allows the frame rate to go up, whereas reducing resolution does actually nothing to increase frame rate. So now that we know how the game scales, let's generate some optimized settings to maximize performance and visuals. For Flight Simulator 2020, my optimized settings are more extreme than the usual, as we do not want to reduce the settings so much in this game that the game loses its next generation sheen. The game is genuinely amazing looking, and a great part of the fun is being wowed by its visuals. At the same time, optimizing a game like this would usually be a monumental task as it has such varied visuals. Flight Simulator has a ton of different environmental types, weather types, where different settings in the menu will have lopsided performance impacts depending upon what's happening on the screen, what terrain you're over, and so on and so forth. But in the end, I was able to find optimized settings in this game rather easily due to the amazing work Asobo Studio has put into crafting the game's graphical presets. But before the settings themselves, the first optimization you can do is by utilizing the game's resolution scaling. In Flight Simulator 2020, going below 100 for resolution scaling enables temporal upsampling or reconstruction as long as TAA is set to on, so leave TAA on in this game. You can see the effects of this reconstruction here in this shot. First you have 4K 100% scaling on the left, 4K with 50% scaling in the middle, so 1080p internally, and then 1080p output at 100% scaling. If you notice, the smoothness of edges on the objects and the level of detail in the middle image is much higher than the straight normal 1080p at 100% scaling. That is because this game's TAA is attempting to reconstruct up to higher resolutions. But it has a sweet spot. As I see it, if you're running the game at 4K or any other similar high density 21:9 equivalent, going down to 80% on that resolution slider leaves really great image quality that is extremely comparable to native 4K. The only difference is a slight level of softness that you can see that you can change by utilizing image sharpening through the driver should you see fit. At 1440p, I found that any value below 90% caused the image to look decidedly degraded and blurry in comparison to a native 1440p. At 1080p, the pixel density to detail ratio in this game is a bit lopsided, so any other value than 100% makes the game look a bit fudgy. So your first optimization depends on your output resolution. 80% at 4K or equivalent, and then 90% at 1440p and none at 1080p. After this, the scaling of the game's graphic options is rather simple due to how the game's presets work. Basically, Ultra as a setting means that the game targets extremely pristine sample counts, densities, and distances where you have trouble seeing any faults at all. This tends to be very expensive though on average, hence how this game has such a GPU punishing reputation at this point. High though, right below Ultra, is only a small drop in quality, but with much more reasonable performance. Medium and low below that bring the game into more current generation territory and start taking away the game's next gen look. Let me show you this behavior with the example of volumetric clouds. At ultra settings, the clouds are incredibly detailed, but in this scene here, the test rig with an RTX 2080 Ti at native 4K is at 37 FPS. Going down to the high setting keeps the level of detail still extremely high, and they show off the exact same phenomenon. FPS is also increased by 8%, which is not bad at all. Going down to medium and low below this sees a lower resolution look and a simplified shading scheme. So even though they have better performance, we don't want to use them in our optimized settings. Having gone through every setting in this game, I can say with quite a lot of certainty that nearly every single setting follows this pattern, like the tree setting here. Ultra is amazingly pristine with how far the trees go out. High is actually not too much different, but runs 5% better. Medium and low below that bring the trees too close to the camera, even though they have great performance wins. So as a flat rule, my optimized settings are the game's high settings, with an exclusion for those settings that touch textures. First, you have anisotropic filtering, which you will leave at 16x no matter what, as we are gaming on PC here. Then you can also leave texture super sampling to 8x8 and texture synthesis to ultra, as the performance differences from turning this down to even the lowest setting is minimal, so I do not see any harm in pushing them to the highest. Then you have the texture resolution setting itself. Turning down from ultra to high and then high to medium reduces the total amount of VRAM utilized by the game by 500 megabytes each time. The low settings then use only a little bit less than medium beyond this. But I did not notice large differences in texture quality from plane height between any of the settings. But I did notice visual degradations in texture quality inside the plane cockpit when you drop below high. Since it does depend on many factors like the amount of VRAM you have and your output resolution, I will recommend high as a precaution for most GPUs with 8GB or lower at 1440p or lower. For example, a GTX 1060 with 6GB of VRAM ran the high textures just fine at 1080p. So in the end, my optimized settings are high across the board, with ultra settings for anisotropic filtering, texture synthesis, and texture super sampling. High is the recommended value for texture settings, but if you have something with more VRAM, then ultra textures should be a-okay. When added up, optimized settings means some huge upticks in performance overall. Going back to New York City on a cloudy day, just utilizing optimized settings at the same resolution as max settings increases performance by 34%. And if you add image reconstruction up from 80% of 4K, the performance increase goes up to a massive 70% on average on an RTX 2080 Ti in this scenario when fully GPU limited. When CPU limited, the gains are nearly just as great. In the punishing New York City scene, optimized settings run 32% faster than the max settings on a Ryzen 3900X. If you take these settings over to the older mid-range cards, which are basically low-end these days, we see some rather uninteresting differences between the RX 580 and GTX 1060. The GTX 1060 is about 5% faster on average, but they're both really only good enough for a 30 FPS cap at these settings at 1080p. Going over to the newer mid-range with the AMD RX 580 and NVIDIA RTX 2060 Super, we see some interesting differences at my recommended settings at 1440p with a 90% scale. Both cards in this punishing scene see frame rates primarily below 60 FPS, as the view of the city is in full here. If you look at the average frame rate, the RTX 2060 looks to be around 12% faster in performance, which is a little bit higher than the usual performance difference we see between these two cards. This is where the importance of the CPU and driver must be stressed. The differences we are seeing here in the scene are a combination of the GPU and the CPU being stressed rather intensely. If we drop resolution down to 540p at those same optimized settings, we can see the differences in driver performance on AMD versus NVIDIA. In some scenes in this benchmark, there is little differences between the cards and their drivers. But in other areas, the NVIDIA driver produces a nearly 20% increase in frame rate over AMD. And we can also see that our optimized settings require single-threaded performance better than that found on a Core i5-8400, which at its 3.8 GHz is not enough to get reasonably close to 60 FPS. So for 60 FPS, you're looking at a highly clocked Intel processor with 6 threads or more. So with all this info, it's pretty clear that my usual test PC setup is not enough to get the job done if the intent is to run this game at 60 frames per second. I'm running the best possible GPU at the moment, but my high-end test rig with a Ryzen 3900X would be CPU limited, and that's where the Origin system with its Core i9-10900K at stock clocks comes into play. It is also equipped with an RTX 2080 Ti with 11GB of VRAM to push those ultra quality textures at 4K. It also has the NVIDIA driver to use, which means that we'll have more CPU performance on the table than we might have with the AMD driver. With 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum RAM at 3200 MHz, we'll not have to worry about the game overcommitting our system memory. And with Corsair MP510 NVMe drives, we have an ultra-fast base to launch the game from, and to ensure that the streamed graphical data that this game uses from the Azure cloud is piped in quickly to system and graphics memory. So how does the Origin PC fare at my optimized settings here at 4K in the end? Well, I think it worked out rather well, as I have been using all of the footage I captured at these settings as the B-roll running throughout this video. In the calmer scenes of the game, of me just cruising through the countryside on a cloudy day, the game is a rather awesome 60 FPS, and feels absolutely amazing in such moments. This is indeed how a large amount of scenes play out at these settings. But Flight Simulator 2020 is an incredibly dynamic game, where the weather and the ground beneath you affects the performance dramatically. In scenes with a lot of dense geometry on the ground right below you, like you can see here in Rio de Janeiro, my moving closer to the ground in this scene dramatically increases the amount of triangles and discrete objects rendered at the higher detail here. And at optimized settings here, the FPS will drop to around 50 FPS as we get dangerously close to the ground level. Similarly challenging on the GPU are stormy weather conditions with rain and massive clouds and lightning effects, which rapidly change the lighting on volumetric clouds. Here in this scene, the combination of effects works together at this high resolution. You can see the GPU dropping into the middle 50 FPS range periodically as the camera view changes and as the volumetric lighting of the clouds updates in real time. The biggest challenges to the GPU in this game can be found with dual cloud layers and cities at night. When dual cloud layers are on the screen, the amount of graphics processing necessary increases dramatically, and you have one layer of clouds being lit and shadowed, but that upper layer is then also volumetrically shadowing the cloud layer below it. This is insanely next gen and has basically never been in any game before to my knowledge. In such an instance, I saw the FPS going down into the middle 40s and sticking around there for my duration of flying through this incredibly beautiful cloud formation. And the last challenge is cities at night, where you have the clouds above you being lit ambiently from the city glow below, as well as detailed city geometry below you, with literally hundreds to thousands of light sources on screen. Way more light sources than most games, if not all games out there have. In such an instance, here I saw the GPU being incredibly strained, with it being in the low 50s and upper 40s. If you notice here, I'm describing these performance lows as being those related to the graphics card or GPU, as that is the only thing in such moments that is actually getting in the way of up to 60 FPS. While my settings are optimized, they're still incredibly heavy on the GPU at this resolution under certain scenarios, and dropping resolution in any of these cases I showcased would allow the GPU to in fact render the game at 60 FPS just fine. That is because the 10900K powering this Origin PC has tons of spare processing power left over to ensure 60 FPS at these optimized settings. In fact, it may just be one of the only processors out there that can do this in an incredibly reliable manner. Compare next to the Ryzen 3900X at my optimized settings at 540p, we can see that the 10900K spends the toughest part of this benchmark at the beginning in the middle 70s, while the 3900X is just above 60 FPS with 65 FPS or so. As the view of the city eases up, the 3900X finally climbs into the 70 FPS range, while the 10900K is in the 80s and low 90s at times. The CPU is really just a perfect pairing to attempt and achieve 60 FPS in this game, with little chance that the CPU will be the limiting factor in performance. In fact, there is such headroom above 60 FPS that I ended up recording all of the 60 FPS B-roll footage that you saw in this video while playing the game at the same time. Yep, you heard me correctly. I ran the HDMI out of the GPU directly back into the PC through the Elgato 4K 60 Pro capture card and sent it out to my monitor, and then I used our internal performance analysis tools to record 4K 60 FPS gameplay onto one of the NVMe drives in the system. This recording is all being done on the CPU, so I am recording the game's performance at 4K 60 while playing it at the same time. This is such an awesome feat of performance, as I am playing a CPU intensive game while utilizing software which is very CPU and storage bandwidth intensive as well. From my own experience in testing, our performance analysis capture needs at least 8 CPU threads and its own separate SSD bandwidth to ensure 4K 60 capture on the CPU without dropping frames. The Origin PC setup here has enough power and storage bandwidth to do that and play the game at the same time, and also manages to look darn cool while doing it. I especially like how the capture card is basically a flight data recorder. So in the end here, we learned a few things. Flight Simulator 2020 looks amazing, but it requires a lot of single-threaded CPU performance and as much GPU performance as you can throw at it to achieve 60 FPS at higher resolutions in all of the various challenging scenarios that this game contains. We also learned that the game's high performance preset with a few adjustments gives great quality for optimized settings. Optimized settings that definitely win back a lot of performance, but only the most powerful CPU out there is really going to be able to ensure a proper 60 FPS in those scenes cruising around cities. On the GPU side, Flight Simulator 2020 is going to scale amazingly far into the future, as an RTX 2080 Ti will still require resolution concessions at optimized settings. And really, I definitely look forward to that future, and I cannot wait to test this game on future GPU hardware, and also see where the developers take this game with DX12, hopefully enabling this game to use more threads, and also ironing out the occasional frame time hitches that it can have. And until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you are already a subscriber, then please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, consider supporting Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about Microsoft Flight Simulator, then write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.